Marcus Hill had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours in 11 months. Not since the last hospital bill arrived. Not since the bank sent its third warning letter about the truck. Not since he sat at the kitchen table, stared at the final notice from the landlord, and understood with perfect, airless clarity that there was no one left in the world who would catch him if he fell. He was 38 years old. He had a 10-year-old daughter who believed in him absolutely, and he had exactly $43 in his checking account. He worked 3 jobs, which sounds like a sentence about ambition, but was actually a sentence about survival. Nights, he drove for a food delivery platform, weaving through empty streets from 10 in the evening until 3 in the morning, his old truck rattling at every pothole, the heater blowing cold air he could not afford to fix. Afternoons, when Lily was in school, he picked up shifts at a small repair garage, 2 miles from their apartment, not as a real mechanic, just changing oil and rotating tires for $20 an hour. Weekends, he loaded and unloaded freight at a warehouse on the edge of town. His back aching by noon, his hands cracked from the cold. None of it was enough. The math never worked. He ran the numbers every Sunday night at the kitchen table while Lily slept. And every Sunday night the numbers said the same thing. Not enough. Not enough. Not enough. He had not always lived like this. There was a time not so long ago, though it felt like a different century, when Marcus Hill was considered one of the best young mechanics in the state. He had a gift for engines the way some people have a gift for music. Intuitive. Almost physical. An understanding that lived in his hands and not just his head. He could hear a misfire before the diagnostic scanner found it. He could feel a transmission problem through the steering wheel. He had apprenticed under a man named Raymond Cross, a legendary restorer of vintage automobiles who operated a shop outside of Nashville, and Raymond had told him more than once that Marcus had the rarest quality in the trade, patience, the willingness to understand a machine before touching it. That was before the accident. Before the wet road and the intersection and the other driver who ran a red light at 50 miles an hour. Before Rebecca. Before everything that came after. He had not worked on a real restoration project since. He had not been able to. Every time he got close to something that mattered mechanically, the grief came back in a wave he could not outrun. And he had learned to stay in shallow water where the grief was manageable: oil changes, tir rotation, delivery routes, freight pallets. Nothing that required him to care too deeply. Caring too deeply cost too much. Lily was the exception. Lily, he cared about with a ferocity that frightened him sometimes. She had her mother's eyes, and her father's stubbornness, and an imagination that never stopped moving. She collected pictures of vintage cars cut from magazines and taped them to the wall above her bed. Not because she understood the mechanics, but because she thought they were beautiful: the curves, the chrome, the way they looked like something out of a dream someone had in the 1950s and never woke up from. She also had moderate asthma, which meant inhalers, which meant prescription costs, which meant another column in Marcus's Sunday night math that always came up short. The night he saw the poster, Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table while he reheated 2 packets of instant noodles on the stove. It was late October. The apartment was drafty. She had her inhaler beside her pencil case, casual as an eraser, and Marcus watched her out of the corner of his eye, the way he always did, monitoring the slight catch in her breathing that sometimes came before an episode. She looked up and caught him looking, and smiled. "I'm fine, Dad," she said, which was what she always said, and he nodded and stirred the noodles and tried to look like he believed her. After dinner, after Lily was in bed, he pulled on his jacket to take out the trash and found a community flyer tucked under the building's front door. Evelyn Carter's annual estate automobile exhibition and auction this Saturday. Open to registered guests and the public during preview hours. The flyer said the collection included rare and forgotten vehicles from private estates across the country. It said, "You never know what gets overlooked." Marcus read that line twice. He folded the flyer and put it in his jacket pocket. He stood in the cold outside the building for a long time, looking at nothing in particular. Then he went back inside. He almost didn't go. He told himself he was going for the wrong reasons, that a man who could barely pay his rent had no business walking into a room full of millionaires hoping to find treasure. But Lily found the flyer on the kitchen counter Saturday morning, and read it with shining eyes and said, "Dad, you know more about cars than anyone. If there's something good there, you'll see it." She reached into the pocket of her school backpack and produced a folded envelope. Inside was $8 in carefully saved ones and coins. "For gas," she said. He laughed despite himself. He took the money. He kissed her on the forehead. He drove. Evelyn Carter's estate sat at the end of a long private road flanked by trees that had been professionally shaped into identical silhouettes. As though nature itself had been hired and asked to look presentable, the main house was enormous white stone, tall windows, the kind of architecture designed to communicate a single clear message. "I have more than you will ever have." The grounds were immaculate. A stone fountain turned slowly in the October wind. Hedgerows ran along the perimeter in perfect geometric lines. Valets in black uniforms directed vehicles into a designated parking area where the guests' cars alone were worth more than Marcus's entire building. He counted 3 Porsches, 2 Bentleys, and something Italian he couldn't identify from a distance, but which sat close to the ground with the alert posture of an expensive animal. He parked at the far edge of the lot, next to the fence, and sat in his truck for a moment, breathing. He had put on his best clothes, a collared shirt that was clean but fraying at one cuff, dark pants with a slight shine at the knees. He knew how he looked. He walked toward the entrance anyway. The security guard at the door, a young man with the particular expression of someone who has been trained to assess people's worth at a glance, looked Marcus up and down, and then said, with practiced neutrality, that the exhibition was for registered guests and accredited collectors. Marcus said he'd seen the public preview hours on the flyer. The guard made him wait for 6 minutes before confirming this was technically correct and stepping aside, with the specific reluctance of a person who had been hoping it wouldn't be. Inside, the main exhibition space was a converted barn that had been renovated into something between a gallery and a showroom, with track lighting and climate control and a champagne station near the entrance. The transformation was flawless exposed, beams painted in muted gray, polished concrete floors, the kind of studied rusticity that costs more than actual luxury. The cars on display were extraordinary. A 1968 Shelby, a restored Ferrari from the early 70s, a pre-war Bugatti under a glass shield. People moved between them in small clusters, speaking in low, expert voices. Journalists from automotive publications photographed the displays. A woman in a cream dress was explaining provenance to a group near the Ferrari, using the word impeccable 3 times in 2 sentences. A man in a blazer gestured at a pre-war coupe and said something about matching numbers, while his companion nodded in the way people nod when they are pretending to know what matching numbers means. Marcus moved carefully through the room. He was aware of every glance, not all of them hostile, but all of them noting him, cataloging the fraying cuff and the department store shoes, and the general air of a man who had come a long way to be somewhere he could not quite afford to be. He kept his face neutral, and his movements deliberate. He had been underestimated in rooms before. He had learned that underestimation, while painful, was also a kind of freedom. If no one expected you to know anything, you could learn a great deal without anyone noticing. Marcus was aware, at every moment, that he did not belong in this room. Not by their definition. He moved quietly along the walls, looking, not touching, reading the information placards with a mechanic's eye rather than a collector's. The cars were beautiful. He could not afford any of them. He was trying to find something underpriced, something overlooked, something he could buy cheaply, and restore and sell for enough to cover 2 months of Lily's medication costs. He was looking for the car that no one else wanted. He found it in the back. There was a secondary space off the main hall, not quite a kiosk, but not exactly the main floor either, more like an overflow storage area that had been partially cleared to display secondary inventory. At the far end of this space, pushed against the wall beneath a dusty canvas drop cloth, sat a car. Not displayed, not lit, not on a placard, just sitting there. Forgotten, or abandoned, or simply overlooked, covered in grime, and the particular stillness of something that has not been touched in a very long time. Marcus stood in front of it, and felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in years. He could not have said what it was, exactly. Recognition, maybe. The way you recognize a piece of music you haven't heard since childhood. He crouched beside it. The profile was unusual, longer than standard, lower than it should be for the era the bodywork suggested, the hood line sloping with an aerodynamic intentionality that was decades ahead of its time. He could see where the chrome trim had been removed or had fallen away, leaving ghost marks in the paint. The paint itself was badly oxidized, peeling at the edges, the original color buried under years of filth. But the bones of this car were extraordinary. He was still crouched beside it, running one finger along the rocker panel, when the room around him went quiet in a particular way. The kind of quiet that has a direction. He looked up. Evelyn Carter was 51 years old, and she moved through a room, the way a weather system moves through a valley. You felt her coming before you saw her. She was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Marcus made in a month, her dark hair pulled back with architectural precision. She was flanked by 2 assistants and a man in a blazer who turned out to be the estate's attorney. She had been doing a walkthrough of the exhibition when someone Marcus didn't see who had pointed in his direction, and she had changed course toward him with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had never once in her adult life felt out of place anywhere. She stopped a few feet from Marcus and looked at him, not at the car, at him. The look lasted 2 or 3 seconds, but it was a thorough look, the kind that calculates and categorizes, and arrives at a conclusion before the other person has had time to speak. Around them, the cluster of guests and assistants who had followed her drift had gone quiet, watching. "Can I help you with something?" she said. Her voice was pleasant on the surface, the way a surface can be pleasant. Marcus stood up. He was aware of his fraying cuff. He kept his hands at his sides. "I was looking at this one," he said. Nobody had information on it. Evelyn looked at the car under its drop cloth with an expression of mild distaste, as though she had forgotten it existed and was irritated by the reminder. "That thing," she said. "It came with a lot purchase. 3 other vehicles from an estate in Kentucky. The other 3 were worth something. That one," she paused, and the pause had performance in it. "That one is exactly what it looks like. Do you know the make?" Marcus asked. The pause stretched. Someone in the watching crowd made a sound not quite a laugh, but close. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Do I know the make?" she repeated. It was not really a question. "I know that it's taken up space in my storage facility for 2 years, and that 3 separate appraisers have looked at it and passed. I know that the engine is seized, the documentation is missing, and no one," she let the word settle, "no one credible has expressed the slightest interest." She looked at Marcus again. Until now, apparently, the crowd laughed. Not everyone, but enough. A man to Marcus's left said something quietly to the woman beside him, and they both smiled. One of the photographers lowered his camera and tilted his head with the expression of someone who has stumbled onto an unexpectedly entertaining scene. Marcus did not look at any of them. He kept his eyes on Evelyn Carter. "What are you asking for it?" he said. Another pause. Evelyn's expression shifted into something that was technically a smile. "I'm not asking anything for it," she said. "It's not worth the paperwork to list it. Truthfully," and here she raised her voice slightly, because she was talking to the room now. "Not just to Marcus. If you can get it running and move it off my property, you can have it. Consider it a gift." She looked at Marcus the way someone looks at a mildly interesting inconvenience. "That is, if a man in your position can manage to get it started." The room responded. Not everyone laughed. Some people looked away with the embarrassed awareness of witnessing something they should not approve of, but the laughter that did come was real and loud, and it bounced off the high renovated ceiling and landed on Marcus like something physical. A man near the champagne station held up his phone. Another cluster of guests had turned fully to watch. The Ferrari and the Shelby forgotten. This was more interesting than Chrome and Provenance. This was spectacle. He felt his jaw tighten. He felt his hands want to close into fists, and he made them stay open. He thought of Lily at the kitchen table with her inhaler beside her pencil case. He thought of the $8 she had given him for gas, 8 single dollars and a handful of coins from a 10-year-old girl who trusted him the way children trust the sky to stay up. He breathed, one breath, steady and deliberate. "I'll take it," he said. Evelyn Carter looked at him for a moment with an expression that flickered something that might have been surprise, quickly swallowed by composure. She lifted one hand in a small gesture of concession. "By all means," she said. "It's yours." She turned back to her guests, already moving on, already reassuming the rhythm of the event. Around Marcus, the laughter faded into murmuring, and then into the normal ambient noise of a wealthy crowd finding something new to look at. He was dismissed. He was already forgotten. He walked back to the covered car alone, and he did not look at anyone in the room, and no one looked at him. And that was fine. He was used to being invisible. The drive home was 40 minutes of complete silence. The broken-down car in tow behind his truck on a borrowed flatbed trailer. The sound of the wheels on the road, the only company Marcus had. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt raw and tired and aware of the absurdity of the situation. A man who could not pay his rent, towing a seized car home from a billionaire's estate because a billionaire had publicly dared him to take it. He had no logical reason to believe the car was anything other than what Evelyn Carter said it was. He was operating on something less rational than logic. He was operating on feel. He pulled the car into the bay of the small repair garage where he worked afternoons. His boss, a good-natured man named Patrick who owed Marcus several favors, had agreed to let him use the space on weekends. Marcus pulled the drop cloth off completely and stood in the fluorescent light with a work lamp and looked at the car for 2 hours without touching anything. He walked around it. He got on his hands and knees and looked under the chassis. He sat in the driver's seat and ran his hands over the dashboard. The interior was destroyed, cracked leather, collapsed headliner, a steering wheel that had been wrapped in electrical tape at some point and then forgotten. But the instrument cluster was unusual. The gauges were handmade. Not factory-stamped, actually handmade. The faces individually calibrated. The needles custom bent. This was not a production vehicle. This was something someone had built. He found the VIN plate, or rather, the absence of a VIN plate. Where the plate should have been, there was a bracket. And where the bracket should have held a standard identification number, someone had installed a plate with a completely different numbering system, not a replacement. The bracket was original to the car. Whoever built it had never intended it to have a standard VIN. It had its own system. He called his old friend Dennis Marsh at 11 o'clock at night. Dennis had been with him at Raymond Cross's shop, had 20 years in restoration, and currently ran his own operation in Memphis. He answered on the third ring, sleepy and suspicious. "I need your eyes on something," Marcus said. "Can you come Saturday?" "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet. That's why I need your eyes." Dennis came on Saturday morning, pulling into the garage with a coffee and the expression of a man who has driven 3 hours based on a phone call and is reserving judgment. He walked around the car twice without speaking. He crouched at the engine bay, which Marcus had gotten partially opened the day before. He stood up. He walked around again. He stopped at the rear of the car and pointed at a seam along the lower body panel. "See that weld?" he said. "Yeah," Marcus said. "That is not a production weld. That is hand-laid. A craftsman did that. One person. Not an assembly line." "I know. The engine block," Dennis said slowly. "What did you make of the engine block? The casting marks don't match anything in the standard reference books." "I've been through 4 of them." Dennis looked at him. His expression had changed. "You found the frame stamp?" "There is no frame stamp. There's a maker's mark. Hand engraved." Silence. Dennis walked back to the driver's side and looked at the instrument cluster again, leaning close, his breath fogging slightly in the cold garage air. He straightened up. "Marcus," he said, and his voice had gone careful and quiet in a way it had not been before. "You know about the Orion Motor Company." Marcus knew about Orion Motor Company. Everyone in serious automotive history knew about Orion Motor Company. It was the kind of story told at restoration shops and collector gatherings, the way ghost stories are told around campfires with reverence and a slight disbelief. Orion had been a small American automotive manufacturer that operated out of Detroit between 1958 and 1964. They had produced exactly 4 models before closing. Their work was considered by many historians to be a generation ahead of its time. The aerodynamics, the engine design, the material choices. The company had collapsed due to financial pressure and the death of its founder, a self-taught engineer named Harold Voss, who had started Orion with his own savings after working 17 years on an assembly line. What most people did not know, what only very serious collectors knew, was that before Harold Voss died, he had built one final car. A prototype, a singular vehicle that represented everything he had learned and everything he believed about what an automobile could be. The car had been transported to a private showing in 1966, 2 years after the company closed, and then it had disappeared. No one knew what happened to it. It had been missing for nearly 30 years. Auction houses had offered rewards for its authentication. Museums had conducted searches. It was considered, in automotive collector circles, to be the most significant lost vehicle in American history. No, Marcus said, because the alternative was impossible. The alternative was the kind of thing that didn't happen to people like him. The maker's mark, Dennis said. What does it look like? Marcus brought the work lamp close to the frame area he had partially cleaned and aimed the beam. The engraving was small and worn but legible, cut into the metal with a steady hand. HV, OMC, 1966. Dennis Marsh sat down on a shop stool and put his hands on his knees and didn't say anything for a long time. I need to make some calls, he finally said. Lily found out the next morning. Because Marcus could not keep anything from her, she had her mother's ability to read his face, and she had read it across the breakfast table and said, "Something happened. Tell me." So he told her. He showed her the photographs he had taken, walked her through the details carefully. Watching her face, she listened with her whole body, the way she always listened to things that mattered, not moving, barely blinking. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she put her arms around him and held on and said into his shoulder, in a voice that was steady and clear, "Mom's helping us." He held on too. He did not trust his voice enough to answer. It was Dennis who made the calls. He contacted 3 separate automotive historians, one at a university in Michigan, one who worked with the Smithsonian's Transportation Collection, one who was the foremost independent authority on Orion Motor Company's documented output. Each of them asked to see photographs immediately. Each of them went quiet for a long time after seeing the photographs and then asked a series of increasingly specific questions. By Tuesday afternoon, all 3 had said the same thing. Independently, without consulting each other, this car needed to be inspected in person. The number of identifiable markers, the engine casting, the hand-calibrated instruments, the frame construction, the maker's mark was consistent with what fragmentary documentation existed about Harold Voss's final prototype. If this was what it appeared to be, it was not just the rarest car in America. It was the most significant automotive artifact of the 20th century. Marcus had not been sleeping. He worked on the car every night from 9 until 2 or 3 in the morning, not rushing, not forcing, doing exactly what Raymond Cross had taught him to do, which was to understand before acting. He was methodical. He cleaned carefully, documented everything he uncovered, made detailed notes about each component. The engine had seized due to dried fuel deposits. Not internal failure, the mechanical components beneath the corrosion were sound. The body damage was surface level. The car had been stored poorly, not abused. Someone, at some point, had deliberately removed the identifying logos and the VIN hardware, probably in an attempt to make it less recognizable, or perhaps to prevent it from being traced. But nothing essential had been damaged. On Thursday evening, Dennis called with news that broke like a wave. A collectors' consortium, a group of serious private buyers and institutional museums that tracked automotive artifacts of historical significance, had been contacted by one of the historians, and they were responding with considerable urgency. An international auction house had reached out directly. They were prepared to facilitate a specialized auction, the kind reserved for objects of extraordinary cultural and financial significance. The estimate, based on preliminary authentication and comparable sales in related categories, was between $5 and $10 million. Evelyn Carter found out on Wednesday, from a journalist who had been at the estate the day Marcus took the car, and who had the professional instinct to follow up on an apparently absurd story about a broke delivery driver towing a worthless junk car home from a billionaire's auction. The journalist had made some calls of his own. The article he published on Wednesday morning was measured and careful, using words like preliminary authentication and, if confirmed, But the headline was not measured or careful, and by midday it had traveled far and wide. Single father may have taken home America's rarest lost car for free. The response from Evelyn Carter's office was swift and, in retrospect, poorly managed. A spokesperson issued a statement saying the transfer of the vehicle had been informal and undocumented, and that the company would be reviewing its legal position. This statement, read alongside the headline, was interpreted by essentially everyone as a billionaire trying to take back a car she had given away as a public humiliation. The secondary wave of coverage was worse than the first. Radio stations covered it. Editorial writers wrote about it. A late-night host mentioned it in his opening remarks. The story had a shape that people recognized. The powerful person dismissing the powerless one. The powerless one walking away with the treasure. The powerful person suddenly remembering what the treasure was worth. Marcus's phone rang constantly. He did not answer most calls. He spoke to Dennis, to the historians, to the attorney. Dennis had insisted he retain immediately a woman named Carol Engel, who specialized in estate and property law, and who reviewed the documentation of the vehicle transfer within hours of being contacted and told Marcus, quietly and clearly, that his position was legally solid. The transfer had been made verbally, in public, witnessed by dozens of people, many of whom had recorded it on their phones. There was no contractual claim Evelyn Carter could make that would hold. On Thursday morning, Evelyn's personal assistant called Dennis directly and offered $500,000 for the vehicle. Dennis relayed the number to Marcus. Marcus sat with it for a moment, a number so far beyond anything he had ever held in his life that it felt abstract, like a figure from a different language, and then said no. That evening, Evelyn Carter herself called. Marcus answered, because he thought it was important to answer. She spoke first in professional language carefully worded, the vocabulary of negotiation. She said she understood emotions were running high. She said she was prepared to be generous. She said the car had sentimental value to her that went beyond its market price. When I asked you about it, Marcus said, you told me it was worthless like my life. A pause. Long enough that he thought she might hang up. I'm offering $2 million, she said. The auction house says it could go to 10. Marcus said. But that's not why I'm saying no. I'm saying no because of what you did in that room. In front of all those people, you used that car to tell me what you thought I was worth. I'm not selling it back to you. He ended the call. He sat in the garage in the dark for a while, listening to the night traffic outside, listening to the particular quietness of the car in front of him. Then he picked up his tools and went back to work. The story about the letter did not emerge until the night before the auction, and it emerged because of a discovery Marcus made while doing a final detailed inspection of the interior. In the lower section of the passenger's seat, hidden behind a panel that was only accessible if you knew it was there, attached to a seam in the upholstery with a strip of aged adhesive, was a compartment. Inside the compartment was a manila envelope, thick and rigid, sealed with a type of tape that had dried to brittleness but still held. Marcus brought it to the light and looked at it for a long time before opening it. Inside the envelope were 3 things. The first was a stack of photographs, black and white, showing a man Marcus did not recognize working at a drafting table and later in a garage, bending over what was clearly the car in the bay in front of Marcus. The man looked to be in his 40s, a lean, focused face, hands that knew their work. The second item was a set of hand-drawn design plans, 12 pages, the lines precise and unhurried, each diagram labeled in small, neat handwriting. And the third item was a letter. 2 pages, written in the same hand as the labels on the diagrams, dated November of 1966. Marcus read the letter once, then he read it again. Then he sat in the driver's seat of Harold Voss's prototype and held the pages in his hands and looked at the ceiling of the garage and understood something he hadn't expected to understand. Harold Voss had written the letter to his daughter. He had written it knowing the company was gone, knowing the prototype would have to be hidden to protect it from creditors, knowing he did not have much time left. He had written it about the car, about why he built it, what it meant to him. He had come from nothing, he wrote. He had spent 17 years on an assembly line because no one gave a man from nothing any other options. He built the car because he needed to prove, to himself and to anyone who would eventually find it, that a man from nothing was not worth nothing. that the value of a person was not determined by where they started. He asked his daughter, wherever she ended up in life, to remember that. To remember where she came from. To never look at another person the way he had been looked at, as though their circumstance defined their worth. Harold Voss had a daughter named Evelyn. Dennis called the auction house. The auction house contacted the historians. The historians confirmed that the letter and the design plans were consistent with Harold Voss's documented handwriting. They had 3 archived examples. Carol Engel was called. Marcus decided, after a long conversation with Dennis, and an even longer time alone in the garage, that Evelyn Carter would be given the opportunity to see the letter before the auction. Not as a gesture of reconciliation, not as a bargaining tool, because Harold Voss had written it for her, and that was still true regardless of everything else. He had an assistant deliver a copy to her office Friday morning. The auction took place on a Saturday, exactly 7 days after Marcus Hill had towed that car out of Evelyn Carter's estate while the room laughed around him. The venue was a converted theater downtown, the kind of space used for significant events, high ceilings, professional staging. A room that held 400 people and had a live feed to bidders in 9 countries. Marcus sat in the front row with Dennis on one side and Carol Engel on the other. Lily was at school. He had not told her what to expect. He had not wanted to build toward a number that might not come, and he had not trusted himself to keep his composure if she was in the room. Before he had left the house that morning, Lily had made him coffee the way she had recently taught herself to do it, too strong, with too much sugar, served in the green mug she knew was his favorite. She handed it to him with both hands and looked up at him and said, "Whatever happens today is already more than we had last week." He had taken the mug and looked at her and thought, not for the first time, that she was a great deal braver than he had ever managed to be. The auctioneer was a man named Robert Fitch, who had been conducting sales of significant automotive artifacts for 22 years. He opened with a description of the vehicle's provenance that took 11 minutes and covered Harold Voss's history, the Orion Motor Company's legacy, the circumstances of the car's disappearance, and the manner of its discovery. He did not dramatize it. He did not need to. The story was sufficiently dramatic on its own. He described Harold Voss in terms that were factual and unadorned, an assembly line worker who taught himself engineering, who spent the last savings of a collapsing company building a single car that embodied everything he believed a machine could be and a person could prove. He described Marcus Hill's identification of the vehicle in 3 sentences, without editorializing. The room was already quiet before he finished. Then he opened the bidding at $500,000. It moved fast at first, and then began to slow as the number climbed. The way all significant auctions slow when the casual bidders have fallen away, and only the serious ones remain. 1 million. 1.8. 2.5. A pause at 2.5 that lasted 45 seconds, and felt much longer a silence in which 400 people held very still, and Marcus stared at a fixed point on the stage, and breathed steadily, and thought about nothing, the way he had learned to think about nothing when the world was doing something large and unavoidable around him. 3 million. A new bidder, a museum consortium from Europe that had been dormant since the opening, came in at 3.2 and changed the dynamic entirely. The energy in the room shifted. 4 million. 4.5. The room was absolutely quiet, in the way rooms get quiet when everyone is afraid to breathe, when the collective awareness has contracted to a single point in time, has become elastic and strange. 5 million. Another pause. 6. 6.5. 7. At 7 million, there were 2 bidders left, the European Museum Consortium and an anonymous buyer on the telephone, whose representative stood at a desk to the left of the stage, a woman in a gray suit who listened to something in her earpiece and wrote numbers on a notepad with a pen that did not waver. They went back and forth 3 more times. 7.5, 7.8, 8 million. Robert Fitch looked around the room slowly and with great ceremony. He said, "I have $8 million. Are there any further bids?" Silence. Fair warning. Silence so complete that Marcus could hear the ventilation system and the sound of someone shifting in a chair 3 rows behind him. The gavel came down. The sound it made was surprisingly small for what it meant. A single clean crack of wood on wood, and then the room came apart. Applause, voices, the movement of hundreds of people simultaneously releasing held breath, the particular noise of a crowd at the exact moment that a story resolves, and everyone understands that they have witnessed something they will describe to other people for years. Marcus heard it all from somewhere slightly removed from his own body. He was aware of Dennis's hand on his shoulder. He was aware that his own hands were shaking in his lap, the fine tremor of a man who has been holding on very hard for a very long time and has just been told he can let go. He sat very still and let the noise happen around him. He thought about Rebecca, about the way she had laughed, sudden and total, like a door swinging open. He thought about the kitchen table and the instant noodles and the drafty apartment and Sunday night math that never added up. He thought about Lily's $8. He thought about the assembly line worker in a Detroit garage in 1966, bending over a drafting table by lamplight, building something beautiful in secret because he needed to prove something about what a person was worth. He thought that Harold Voss had been right, that it was possible to prove something like that the proof might take 30 years to arrive. But it came. He did not cry in the theater. He had known he would not cry in public. He saved it for the parking structure. 15 minutes after the auction ended, sitting in his truck with his forehead against the steering wheel, while the city went about its Saturday afternoon, people carrying groceries, someone walking a dog, a bus stopping at the corner. All the ordinary continuations of ordinary life, happening around a man in a truck who had just arrived somewhere he had not known he was going. Evelyn Carter had been in the room. He had not seen her come in. But he saw her when he stood up. She was near the back, away from the media, standing alone. She was not with her assistants. She was not performing anything for anyone. She was just standing there, watching, and her face had an expression Marcus had not seen on her before and could not fully name. He looked at her for a moment across the crowded room. Then he nodded, once, and looked away. She found him afterward, in the lobby, before he could leave. She came alone, which surprised him. She was not carrying anything. She stopped a few feet away, the same distance she had kept at the estate. But the posture was entirely different now. She looked like someone who had been traveling a long way and had recently arrived somewhere they hadn't expected. "I read my father's letter," she said. Marcus waited. "I had forgotten," she said. And then, when that seemed insufficient, "I had chosen to forget. Where we came from. What it was like." She paused. "I looked at you in that room, and I saw someone I decided didn't belong there. Someone whose circumstances I took as evidence of their value." She stopped again. Her voice was even, controlled, but only just. "My father would have been ashamed of me," Marcus said. "Your father sounds like a good man." He was. Another pause. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix the moment. I know you can't give a person back the dignity they had before a room full of people laughed at them. I know that." She looked at him steadily. "But I wanted to say it." Marcus thought about Harold Voss's letter. Thought about a man on an assembly line for 17 years who built a car in a garage to prove something about what a person was worth. Thought about where value actually came from and what it cost to lose sight of it. "I hear you," he said. It was not a forgiveness. And it was not a dismissal. It was what it was. Acknowledgement. The recognition that she had said something real, and he had received it. Evelyn Carter nodded once. She walked away. What Marcus did with the money was not complicated. He paid every debt, first the rent, the bank note on the truck, the outstanding medical invoices, the small amounts he owed to people who had helped him through difficult months. He set up a trust for Lily's education and medical costs. Structured so that the money would be there regardless of what happened to anything else. He retained enough to make the rest possible. He bought the garage. Patrick, his boss, had been planning to retire and had mentioned more than once that he didn't know what would happen to the property. Marcus bought it at a fair price, took 2 weeks to renovate and equip it properly, and reopened it as Hill Automotive, a full-service garage with one specific program built into its operating structure from the first day. A free maintenance clinic, open every Saturday morning, for vehicles owned by single parents, elderly residents, and families living below the poverty threshold. Oil changes, brake inspections, Basic repairs, no charge. He staffed it with 2 full-time mechanics and 3 apprentices, all of whom he paid well. He also established a vocational scholarship, the Rebecca Hill Memorial Scholarship, named for his wife, that funded automotive training and apprenticeship programs for young people from low-income households. He partnered with 3 community colleges and 2 trade schools in the region. In the first year, 11 young people enrolled on full scholarships. By the second year, that number doubled. Marcus interviewed each applicant himself, sitting across a workbench from young people who reminded him in their steadiness, their careful answers, their barely contained urgency of the person he had been at their age, before the world had spent years trying to convince him that urgency wasn't enough. He found he liked those conversations more than almost anything else in his life. There was something that happened in them, a transfer of something he couldn't name exactly, but which felt like the opposite of what Evelyn Carter had done to him in that room. In that room, someone had looked at him and assigned him a diminished value. In these conversations, Marcus looked at young people and saw what they could become, and said so plainly, and watched their faces change the way faces change when someone says an accurate, true thing about them that they had hoped was true but had not yet been told. The photograph of Harold Voss's prototype hung in a frame on the wall of the garage, above the service counter, where every customer could see it. Not a trophy, not a monument to a lucky day, just a reminder that a machine built by one determined person in a garage, a person from nothing, with nothing, using only savings and skill and the stubborn refusal to accept that ordinary meant worthless, could become the most significant thing in a room full of extraordinary things. Harold Voss had known that. He had known it when no one else believed it. He had written it in a letter and hidden it in the car, and trusted that, eventually, someone with the right hands and the right eyes would find it. Marcus thought about that sometimes, in the quiet early mornings before the garage opened, when he stood in front of the photograph with coffee and looked at the car that had changed everything. He thought about how long that letter had waited, 30 years, in a hidden compartment, in a car covered in dust in a storage facility, passing through hands that never thought to look beneath the surface. He thought about what it required of Harold Voss to write that letter, knowing it might never be found, to believe in a future reader without any evidence one existed. He thought that was a kind of faith he wanted to practice. Not the religious kind, though he held no judgment about that. The practical kind. The kind that involves doing the careful work without the guarantee of a witness. The kind that keeps going when the math doesn't add up on Sunday nights. He thought about all of this less and less as time passed, which was how it should be. Life moved forward, with the particular momentum of lives that have found their footing. The garage. The scholarship students. Lily's 8th grade science fair project about hybrid engine systems. The mornings that started early and ended late and felt full rather than depleted. The winter after the auction. On a Saturday morning in December, Lily came with Marcus to the garage for the first time to see the free clinic in operation. She was 10 years old and serious, and wore her jacket against the cold, and watched everything with the focused attention she brought to everything that interested her. She watched Marcus talk to a woman whose sedan had a brake warning light. She watched one of the apprentices, a 19-year-old named James, who had grown up in a situation not unlike Marcus's own, explain a repair to an elderly man who kept nodding and asking good questions. She watched the waiting area fill up with people who had come because they needed help and had found it. On the drive home, she sat quietly for a long time. The city moved past the windows in the particular way cities move when you are watching them from the inside of something warm. The storefronts and the pedestrians and the traffic lights cycling red to green to red, all of it going about its ordinary business, indifferent and continuous, and somehow deeply reassuring. Then she said, "I told you, Dad. I told you luck was coming." Marcus glanced at her. Outside, the city was gray and cold, and going about its December storefronts decorated with lights. A man walking a dog. Someone carrying a box that was too large for them. The whole familiar pageant of a world that does not stop moving for anyone's private reckoning. He thought about everything it had taken to get to this particular moment, in this particular car, on this particular road, the years of not enough, the Sunday night math that never worked, the cold apartment and the inhalers, and the borrowed flatbed trailer, and a room full of people who laughed. He thought about a man named Harold Voss, who built something beautiful in secret to prove that where you came from was not the same as what you were worth. He thought about how long that proof had waited in the dark, and how patient it had been, and what it meant that the right person had finally found it. It wasn't luck, he said. Lily considered this. What was it? Marcus watched the road ahead of them, the ordinary gray road leading toward their ordinary life, which was not ordinary at all anymore. Or maybe had never been ordinary, or maybe had always been exactly as extraordinary as every other ordinary life lived by someone who refused to accept the verdict other people handed down. It was the right car in the right hands, he said. That's all it ever was. Lily nodded, apparently satisfied. She looked out her window at the passing city. She was quiet, which meant she was thinking about something, and Marcus let her think. The heater worked now. The truck ran smooth. He drove home through the last light of the winter afternoon, and for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, he was not afraid of what the next week would cost.